I'm going to introduce everybody at once, and then Jeff Bilbro is actually going to introduce a book project that's coming out of this panel. Jeff Bilbro, our first speaker, is a Baylor PhD from our department, and is now at Grove City College. He's an associate professor there, also editor of a journal you might have heard of, Porch Republic. So I commend that to your attention. There is a print version as well as an online. So you have to for Front Porch Republic, right? He's done a series of books, and I actually can't keep up with all of Jeff's books anymore, but books on Wendell Berry, ecological ethics, and then a great recent book called Reading the Times, which I commend to your attention. And the Times is a play on words. Our next speaker, Rachel Griffis, is another Baylor PhD who teaches at Spring Arbor University in Michigan, where she is the chair of English and an associate professor. She has been working a lot in recent years on Cormac McCarthy, an author you may have heard of, religion and literature, and she has made a long trip here, and we're glad she's here. You both have come a long ways, as have you. You've all come down to where it's sunny. We're having an early spring here. Last but not least, Richard Gibson, University of Virginia PhD, who's done a great book on forgiveness and Victorian literature, also a book on charitable writing, and then a really recent book from InterVarsity, which I haven't read and I need to read, The Way of Dante, C.S. Lewis, Dorothy Sayers, and Charles Williams, and how they've all responded to Dante in their works. As you'll see, they're going to each give a 5 to 7 minute summary of their paper. I'm going to ask them a question or two, hopefully a linking question, and then we're going to just sort of open the floor to what they have to say. They all have strategies, all English professors, strategies to help our students think about ways to combat AI, cognitively in other ways. So with no further ado, Jeff Bilbro.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to be here. Back home, our maple trees are running, and I think you don't have maple trees here, so. So yeah, about 18 months ago, I guess, we got a CCCU networking grant, and these 3 papers are part of this, and there's about, 20 plus of us gathered at Grove City, I guess just this fall, to kind of workshop through some ideas, and it's going to be published, in a while, from Abilene Christian University Press, so we're excited about that. I'll just briefly give an outline. The book has does have 4 sections. The first section looks at metaphors and narratives that we might use to help our students understand what AI is and what it does to them. So if you heard Josh Brake's presentation yesterday, he's working in that first section. The second section is about classroom practices and assignments that might remove the temptations that students face to rely inappropriately on AI. So as opposed to just telling them, don't use it, what if we reimagine our practices so that they can't use it? And then third, what are some extracurricular ways of fostering cultures of disciplined inquiry? Because in many ways, AI does not present new problems, new challenges to students' attention or their thinking. It just exacerbates pre-existing problems. And we really have to help students experience the joys of pain, the joys of learning and struggle, and the mastery that can come from that. And then the fourth section is about workable classroom or institutional policies that might communicate our expectations and our rationale so that students understand why we're asking them to do what we're asking them to do. So, without further ado, I'll jump into my brief synopsis of what I'm doing and then open it up. I think my main point is simply this, that one of the ways that LLMs and AIs dramatically alter our informational ecosystem is by muting the particular voices of particular people. I think that's a big problem. So when you do a Google search, for instance, the AI-generated result just distills information from across the web into an answer that is personalized to who they think you are and what they think you want. And this might seem fine if you're asking a cut and dried question like, who was the American League batting champion in 1995? Edgar Martinez. Unambiguous, right? And it may even seem fine when there's a kind of clear, uncontroversial answer, right? If you just want some information. But most of the questions that are interesting, most of the questions that we want our students to learn how to engage, are disputed questions, right? Kenneth Burke's famous parlor metaphor for academic writing, you're probably familiar with this, imagines, right, academic writing as entering into an ongoing, unending conversation, learning what other people are saying, and then becoming capable of contributing to that in a meaningful fashion. But if asked to answer a question, LLMs simply spit out, on the one hand this, some people say this, on the other hand that, some people say that. Yeah, here's the information. Quite literally, they're simply regurgitating received opinion, and students know this. They know that the machine cannot take a stand. Right? Wendell in his essay Standing by Words, says that one of our tasks is to become persons capable of standing by our words, and this is precisely what an LLM cannot do. There is no person that is morally responsible, or actually legally responsible, for the words generated by an LLM. Think, for instance, of this kind of sycophantic way that a chatbot will apologize if you say you did something wrong. Oh, I'm so sorry. You're right. Right? There's no backbone. So I think the result of this is that our students are tempted to become sort of epistemic nihilists. What I'm meaning by this is that there might be truth out there, but there is no way that I have to access that truth. There's no way that I have to become capable of standing by some truth. In Harry Frankfurt's term, we might say that generative AI floods our online ecosystem with toxic bullshit. It's just noise that is literally unconcerned with truth content. Right? And this is already, polluting other previously sort of reliable or ways of verifying information. Just recently, I've reviewed 2 books from reputable publishers, Viking and Fortress, both of which were riddled with factual errors and AI-generated fake quotations. I mean, just abysmal. There's really disturbing studies on the predominance of apparently AI-generated prose in peer-reviewed literature, right? This is quite common. So already these methods that were already threatened by other forces, right? These methods of verifying information have been further called into question. So in many ways, I think LLM-powered search is attractive precisely because our informational ecosystem is already polluted. There's already so much noise, so this promises to cut through the noise. Joseph Weizenbaum, in his book, Human Judgment and Computer Reasoning, talks about how in some ways computers in the 1960s and 70s propped up bureaucratic systems that were otherwise maybe going to implode under their own weight. And in some ways, I think LLMs have propped up big data and then actually prevented us from making the changes that we need. So looking to AI tools for a solution to this problem of noise, I think, is rather like asking the foxes to guard the henhouse. Right? Robin Speer, who developed an online library that enabled people to look up word frequencies in many different languages to chart how humans are using words, sunsetted her project in 2021 because she says generative AI has polluted the data. I don't think anyone has reliable information now about language usage by humans. Wikipedia editors are facing this challenge, right? I've been talking to some folks in coding, right? Proud open-sourced code repositories have had to close pull requests because they're getting so many pull requests from AI bots that they can't sort through it, right? So relying on LLMs to address the problems that they've caused may have some short-term pragmatic utility, but the overall effect is going to be to further erode the already attenuated disciplines that are actually necessary to pursue truth well. Things like attention, hospitality, charity, wisdom. There are simply no shortcuts to cultivating these virtues. And if our students do not develop them, they will become ever more helpless in this ecosystem. So I'm really interested in classroom assignments, practices that model close reading. I do a lot of reading out loud with my students and sort of show them how I read, how I make sense. Or that help students attend very carefully to particular voices. Right? What does careful attention to a particular voice look like? One assignment that I've been doing more and more in my classes is to simply require students to cast their thesis as a yes or no question in the style of one of Aquinas' Summa entries, and then think through, here are the answers that people have to this, and I have to cite particular sources. Here's where I stand. Here's what, the on the contrary is a particularly important move, right? So force them to think through their question in a disciplined fashion with reference to particular voices. This is not a silver bullet, but it's one way, it's sort of iterative ways to help students become capable of being responsible, capable of responding to the particular needs of their places and the particular members of their intellectual communities. Responsibility literally means having the capacity to answer, right, to respond, to explain your beliefs and your actions to another. And no chatbot can respond in this sense, right? It cannot stand by the answers it gives. It cannot be held responsible for generating verbal tokens that don't suit your desires. So I think in that context, it's particularly important we teach our students to stand by their words. There's no panacea. I think there is no panacea for combating the noise of LLM-produced verbiage. But I would say if we feel overwhelmed, it is helpful to remember that the conditions for truth have never been particularly propitious. The abusers of words have always been numerous, from the sophists of Socrates' day to the tech hypesters of today. And the only genuine remedy for epistemic nihilism that such speech fosters is the same as it has ever been. We have to become, first of all, persons who are capable of response, capable of listening well to others and responding to them carefully, of standing by our words. And as we cultivate those virtues, I think we have grounds for asking our students to develop those as well. Thank you.
So as Richard said, I got my PhD here at Baylor. It's really wonderful to be back. And so I'm going to start with a little story from my time in the graduate program here. So while I was here, the late Dr. James Barkis made his first year graduate students locate library books without using the library's electronic search engine. It wasn't actually my group. It was, I think, maybe 2 groups after me. But we all, of course, were talking about it. So they were expected to know enough about the Dewey Decimal System to find books with only the title and the author's name. I guess we should maybe verify if they did that or not, right? Because we all know that they, could have figured this out. But that was what he asked them to do. From what I understand, they did do it. So when they were completing this assignment, there were a lot of jokes going around among the graduate students about its purpose. One comment has stuck with me, especially in this age of AI. So if Dr. Barkis was trying to prepare students to function in a world without computers, English PhD students would likely have no place in this world. If we were really preparing for the apocalypse, perhaps we should focus less on reading and writing and more on survival skills like hunting, purifying water, suturing wounds. I read a lot of Cormac McCarthy, so there's the man in the road is definitely like Boy Scout, military training, something like that. Why don't we all do that if there are going to be no computers? So in the last 15 years, that was about 15 years ago, I've thought with increasing seriousness about the PhD students that were hunting through the library without call numbers. Since that time, the iPhone has become ubiquitous. More recently, as we all know, students have ChatGPT or some other generative AI tool on their phones, as well as on their tablet or laptop. A book that our group read together, which is called Non-Things, Upheaval in the Life World. I am going to butcher the author's name, Han Byung-chol. Does anybody want to correct me for the recording? So he says that he's describing this situation with the statements, "We no longer dwell on the earth and under the sky, but on Google Earth and in the cloud. Digitalization destroys recollection and touch." So that assignment designed by Dr. Barkis all those years ago has continually challenged me as a teacher making my career in the age of AI. The discipline of English and the humanities more broadly does, I believe, impart essential human skills, though I think generative AI threatens to deplete those skills or perhaps to lead me and the rest of us mistakenly to consider them obsolete. Browsing the library stacks without an exact call number, for example, teaches me the layout of the building. It orients me to the size of each collection. It helps me understand how things located there are related to others. In other words, again, we're going to summon Cormac McCarthy. If the apocalypse occurs, I might benefit from having obtained the skills to create a mental map of a place quickly so that I can outrun a predator or find a hiding place. A humanities course offers practical skills that are applicable to the literal apocalypse, such as creating a mental map, making connections, and problem solving. As I'm planning lessons and designing assignments, I'm keeping in mind this question that I am laughing about. I laughed about 15 years ago, but I still think it, bears asking, how can we prepare for the apocalypse? A lot of what I'm doing as a teacher is evaluating and revising my assignments so that they challenge students to develop their human capacities for these kinds of situations. I'm prioritizing activities that pair intellectual exercises with concrete tasks and experiences in the world. I'm striving to engage my students in learning experiences that develop skills and knowledge that have been depleted by digital technologies, but are nevertheless essential to both our survival and flourishing. So one strategy that I've spent a lot of time on is memorizing literature. This is a practice that plays a part in recovering, protecting, and preserving our humanity, ultimately offering students resources, both internal and practical, that they need to thrive. I really wish I could remember things better than I could, because of my iPhone, right? I have a formal memorization assignment in a general education literature course, and I've also worked to build what I think of as a culture of memorization in my class. I focused on memorization because it ensures that students spend time with the humans and not a machine's words, and hopefully take those words into their minds and hearts. It also means that when students come to my office to recite a passage from Augustine's Confessions, we are both focusing on a human's voice for those brief moments in, two different ways. Christine Rosen writes in The Extinction of Experience, pleasure, hands-on skills, self-reliance, relationships, and connection to nature are all threatened by mediating technology. Daily intimacy with the physical world recedes little by little while our attachment to digital worlds grows. More and more we relate to our world through information about it rather than direct experience with it. Reciting poetry offers us an intense face-to-face human experience that is becoming less and less common, not only to young people, but to all of us. It's a little awkward to have the students sitting in my office reciting poetry, sometimes very badly, but it's good for both of us. In other classes, I have attempted to incorporate tactile experiences with writing, such as requiring students to compose essays in class by hand, to create handwritten and illustrated commonplace books. In an honors literature course, I brought Valentine's Day cards to class and provided students with a selection of quotations about love from famous authors and asked them to glue the quotations into the cards. We're kind of going back to elementary school a little bit here. In a class on adolescent literature, I asked students to complete various reading activities, such as reading in 3 different locations, eating different snacks while reading, and then spending 20 minutes reading aloud to children. I hope that we have talked at this conference a little bit about David Smith's new book, Everyday Christian Teaching. Is anybody familiar with that book here? He's produced some really wonderful things, for a long time now. So that book isn't written specifically to subvert the temptations of AI, but it's written with the challenges in mind that we are all facing. So there's lots and lots of examples in there, teaching ideas that do similar things, connecting an intellectual exercise to other people or to something in the real non-digital world. So I encourage you all to look at that, and there are just tons and tons of examples in that book as well. So to conclude, technology and generative AI in particular is designed to make our lives easier. It's not preparing us for the apocalypse. Perhaps generative AI is one of the main causes of the intellectual and spiritual apocalypse that's also been discussed here. Teachers who find themselves at conferences like IFL have always thought about these big questions and how education prepares our students for all of life. The questions about AI that have dominated conversations among educators in the last few years have pushed me into more extreme versions of these old questions. I don't necessarily think we're asking different questions, but maybe just getting a little bit more extreme, and also about our metaphors, like the apocalypse. How we survive it, whether that's literal, spiritual, or intellectual, I think is one of the questions that we need moving forward. What does it mean to be human, and what aspects of human experience do our disciplines cultivate and need to preserve? Thank you.
Elijah, was it this one?
I see a light.
There we go. Should be good. There we go.
All right, great.
Okay. Just give me one moment to set up. Now, I want to acknowledge the irony of the fact that I'm giving a presentation called Don't Cognitively Surrender, and I'm using my phone and my laptop. So as Richard pointed out, I wrote a book a couple of years ago that was about forgiveness, and I want to point out that these two, my co-panelists, have been very forgiving toward me over the last 2 years, and they're going to have to forgive me again, because I'm giving a full-on paper. It'll be about 12 minutes, because I can't explain the argument any other way. Richard also left off one of my books, which I'm not offended by it at all, but it's the reason why I'm here. So in 2021, I had a book come out called Paper Electronic Literature, an Archaeology of Born Digital Materials, that was partly about text generators, among other subjects. And in that book, I talked about a then new technology called GPT-2, which was by turns delightful to me and troubling to me. And as you can see from today's title, I'm now a bit more troubled than I am delighted. Okay, so I'm going to basically put ideas on the table, and I want to demonstrate some ways that I now talk to students about writing their own papers. Earlier this month, 2 professors at Wharton Business School, Stephen Shaw and Gideon Nave, posted a preprint version of a paper titled Thinking Fast, Slow, and Artificial: How AI is Reshaping Human Reasoning and the Rise of Cognitive Surrender. The authors argue that an update is needed to the two-system framework proposed for thinking about thinking, developed first in cognitive psychology and later popularized by Daniel Kahneman in his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Kahneman's concern was human thinking, how it is often automatic, intuitive, and emotion-driven, while at other times it is slow, deliberative, and analytical. These 2 thought processes he dubbed System 1 and System 2. Our Wharton professors contend that AI presents System 3, a new kind of cognition, and just as notably, and this is why we're bringing it in, an influence on ours. It can augment human thought, Shaw and Nave acknowledge, but they are far more concerned with humans' willingness to surrender our thinking to AIs. They define cognitive surrender as follows: conceptually distinct from cognitive offloading, and we'll get back to that term in a moment, which involves strategically outsourcing a discrete task to an external tool, such as using a calculator, cognitive surrender represents a deeper abdication of critical evaluation, where the user relinquishes cognitive control and adopts the AI's judgment as their own. The distinction from cognitive offloading is important given not only what Shaw and Nave mean by it, but also how other scholars I'll mention later in my presentation use that term. I think they actually mean surrender when they say offload. Here it is being invoked in the sense that Risco and Gilbert originally formulated in their 2016 article, which I still think is worth reading. There, they define cognitive offloading as, quote, and this is a terrible sentence, but this is their quote, the use of a physical action to alter the information processing requirements of a task so as to reduce cognitive demand. I'm sorry. It can be as simple, now it gets a little easier to understand, as tilting your head or setting a reminder on your phone. That's cognitive offloading. With the example of using a calculator, Shaw and Nave signaled their interest in cognitive offloading as a conscious, informed act of delegation. The worker offloads part of a project and then integrates its output into her larger chain of thought. Cognitive surrender, we might say, hands the project over from start to finish. In this case, the user does not make any attempt to check the machine's work. She uncritically adopts whatever information or counsel the AI puts forward. This is a piece for academic publication in the Wharton world, so unsurprisingly, the tone is quite measured. But you can tell while reading the piece that the researchers are troubled first by how quickly and pervasively their human test subjects surrendered, and second by the fact that the accuracy of human conclusions now hinges on AI reasoning whose basis may be inscrutable to us. One of their studies found, for example, that despite half of the AI answers being faulty, subjects not only consistently chose those answers, but felt increasing confidence that their answers were right, by like a measurable degree. They found, too, that participants' choices were not significantly affected by time pressure or incentives, as they had assumed. Surrender was unexpectedly commonplace. The authors stressed that this isn't cognitive miserliness, which was Daniel Kahneman's term for when we use an easier way to solve a problem than the one that requires real thinking, since the human subjects made no attempt whatsoever to construct their own answers. Now, you can read that study for yourself to decide if the methodology is any good and the results as notable as the authors suggest. I cite it not because it's not because it's faultless, but because they give a name, cognitive surrender, to a phenomena that we've already been hearing about from other quarters. Take the 2025 MIT Media Lab study, Your Brain on ChatGPT. Researchers studied the activity in 3 groups of writers' brains as they worked on an essay assignment. The first using brain only, the second with access to a search engine, and the third with access to an LLM. Unsurprisingly, the first group had the most neural connectivity, the second less, and the third significantly less still. But the researchers do seem to have been surprised by how disinclined the members of the third group were to, in their phrase, critically evaluate the LLM's output. As in the Wheaton study, participants simply passed along what the bot spat out. The MIT researchers worry in turn about that becoming a habit. They coined the term cognitive debt, which they define as a condition in which repeated reliance on external systems like LLMs replaces the effortful cognitive processes required for independent thinking. And their results raise concerns they further contend about, quote, the long-term implications for human intellectual development and autonomy. Of course, those of us who teach undergraduates don't need to be told about this data. We already have our own evidence. We've received the academic equivalent of the AI work slop that's been in the news recently, or a paper that's overpolished and delves into academical areas no first semester freshman has ever touched. Or we have encountered a guileless or despairing or exceptionally forthright student who admits to cognitively surrendering to AI, perhaps because they've gotten behind and need a life raft, or doubted that they could have done better than the machine, or belief that this is the way things are going anyway, so why not get started now? AI is changing all of our jobs. Here's one way it's changing mine. I am now in the business of persuading young people not to surrender their ability to think. And the way that I propose that they maintain that faculty is by not prematurely surrendering their writing. That one we have to skip. Why insist on writing? And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we have to practice talking about these things so that we know how to communicate with our students. Right? So why insist on writing? And let me be clear, I mean clearing AI out of the ideation and drafting process. Why insist on that? The short answer is that writing confers cognitive benefits that aren't easy to promote by other means. Writing is thinking. Wrestling with GPT-3 back in the summer of 2022, the philosopher John Simons wisely observed that our physiology imposes limits on what we can do by speech alone. He writes, as a practical matter, it is difficult to maintain lengthy and complex chains of reasoning without the external scaffolding of a stable text. It is for this reason that we teach students how to research the content of their essays, how to develop and construct an argument, how to write an outline, then a draft, then the progressive stages of editing, or how to cull extraneous and keep the essential. At each stage, the student must make decisions. The decision-making, as Simons goes on to say, is what matters, where the action is, cognitively speaking. That stands in stark contrast to our default relationship to LLMs, as discussed earlier, in which it delivers polished work, and we, whether due to indolence, anxiety, or a sense of perceived advantage, hand exactly that in without reflection. But Simon's portrayal, while useful, strikes me as a tad neat. A better account appears in a recent piece by Tim Reckwarth, the director of graduate science writing and research assistant professor of neuroscience and physiology at NYU's Grossman School of Medicine. Discussing his department's decision to ban AI use for thesis proposals and dissertations, despite the realistic impossibility of strictly enforcing such a ban, he explains, anyone who writes seriously will recognize how useful writing can be in the thinking process. You're working on an aims page that seemed clear in your head, but it's just not working when you write it down. The logic that felt sturdy in your mind keeps crumbling on the page. You rearrange, and now something else breaks. After an hour of struggle, you realize that what felt like a communication problem is turning out to be a thinking problem, one you couldn't see until the writing forced you to confront it. The writing as thinking assertion has many proponents, and now some of you are going to write this down and say, this is me, whom we might call in this context cognitive traditionalists. As the writer Flannery O'Connor memorably put it, I write because I don't know what I think until I read what I say. Or as Richard Feynman, right, the great physicist, said of his notebooks, they aren't a record of my thinking process, they are my thinking process. Reckworth, I want to stress, takes seriously the perspective of what he calls AI apologists, who see such a view of writing as a bit too precious. I highly recommend this piece. But he, rightly in my view, concludes that injecting AI into the writing process for students and researchers alike jeopardizes what makes writing most valuable to us cognitively, that it exposes our thinking, flaws and all. Writing is an invaluable occasion for rethinking, as I preach to my students. As I was preparing this talk, I found some unexpected support for this view in a recent essay by a programmer named Siddhant Khare on AI fatigue. Writing of the effect of AI on what he calls engineering thinking, Khare observes, from experience, when you always ask AI first, you stop building neural pathways that come from struggling with a problem yourself. That struggle is where learning happens. The confusion is where understanding forms. Skip that, and you get faster output but shallower understanding. Khare explains that he now spends the first hour of his workday thinking on paper, sketching architectures by hand, reasoning through problems the old way, the slow way. It feels inefficient, he writes. It is inefficient. But it keeps my thinking sharp, and that sharpness pays dividends for the rest of the day when I do use AI, because I can evaluate its output better when my own reasoning is warmed up. To combat cognitive surrender, educators now need to teach and model digital resilience. I take the concept from the German psychiatrist and neuroscientist Manfred Spitzer in his 2016 book, Digital Dementia. Whereas digital dementia characterizes excessive, ultimately erosive dependence on digital devices, digital resilience describes a mature person's ability to use digital technologies consciously and selectively. The digitally resilient person acknowledges both the utility of digital technologies, including AI, and their potential threats to cognitive, emotional, and social development. As numerous commentators have argued, the best user of AI is the one who doesn't need it to do all the thinking, who can develop a novel problem that it can help to solve. To recall my earlier technology, the ideal user offloads when necessary, but does not surrender. Writing for Compact in October, the sociologist Gabriel Rossman described the paradox of education in the age of AI as follows. As the economy adapts to AI, those of us who can take a complementary approach to LLMs will be more productive than those who know nothing but how to ask Grok, is this true? The problem is that developing the skills needed to interact with AI in complementary fashion depends on not relying on them for one's education. I recognize that that claim may seem counterintuitive given the calls we are all hearing to plug AI into every phase of higher ed. But the truth is that generative AI is the most user-friendly form of AI ever invented. I've been studying text generators since 2011. And what's astonishing about this is how little you actually have to do to get it to work for you. It's so user-friendly, and that's a problem. You just write, and it does it. The problem then is to find the right words to tell the genie. That vocabulary requires investing in one's own cognitive development and disciplinary skill set. A friend of mine who runs a software company and uses Anthropic's Cowork daily argues that, quote, kids need to learn the following AI skills in high school, but I think this is true in higher ed. Critical thinking, the ability to communicate with precision. In other words, this is his phrase, English class. Right? And he's an engineer who went to work. More bluntly, I asked students how, if they are simply recycling what ChatGPT said, they are any different than the old kind of bot, the outmoded kind of bot, the sort that simply scraped some text off one part of the web and sent it out into another. Right? Don't become a bot. That was my original talk, or title for today's talk. Even more importantly, I worry about what Kwame Anthony Appiah has called constitutive de-skilling in an October 2025 piece in The Atlantic, which he describes as the erosion of the capacities that make us human in the first place. Anyway, Appiah explains the idea as follows. If people were to learn to frame questions the way the system prefers them, to choose from its menu of plausible replies, the damage wouldn't take the form of spectacular failures of judgment so much as the gradual attenuation of character. Shallower conversation, a reduced appetite for ambiguity, a drift toward automatic phrasing where once we would have searched for the right word, the quiet substitution of fluency for understanding. And that last phrase is really good, right? AI allows us to be so fluent, but do we really understand the words we're passing on? To offload those faculties would be, in effect, to offload ourselves. Appiah is imagining a scenario of sustained, even constant deference to the machine. What should I say? What should I eat? Where should I go? What should I do next? He is not talking about mere cognitive offloading. He is describing total cognitive surrender in which generative AI mediates our encounter with the worlds inside and outside our heads. Thank you.